One of the strongest gifts God ever gave to us as His creation is the ability to communicate. In the narrative of the Scriptures, one of the first actions we see within the heavenly court is communication. In Genesis 1:26, the Hebrew term na'ushe is written in the first person plural, and so it's translated as, "Let us make man in our image." Now, whether God is speaking within the Trinitarian form of the Godhead or is addressing the entire heavenly court, the point is that we see the use of language and communication between them. And God, in making us in His image, grants this ability to us as well, to communicate. But for communication to be effective, there has to be a standard of meaning for vocabulary. Words cannot be arbitrarily defined by individual users. They have to have an agreed upon objective source of meaning. This is why we have dictionaries and lexicons. I mean, imagine for a moment what would happen if, for even 24 hours, people were allowed to interpret traffic signs based upon personal opinions of what words should mean. I mean, imagine if right could also mean left, or stop could also mean proceed. What if speed limit did not just mean the maximum you could go, but could also, if a driver so decided, mean the minimum you were allowed to drive? There'd be mayhem, accidents, collisions, and likely fatalities would result. And so we depend upon an objective source of meaning for the words on our traffic signs to keep order and ensure safety. And more than just physical safety, we understand that language has ethical implications as well. I mean, over the last several years, we've seen the rise of what we know as the Me Too movement, which has sought to help women who have suffered sexual and physical abuse to come forward with their stories. One of the missions of that movement has been to highlight how men in powerful positions often use their authority to force and coerce women into unwanted sexual advances. And so a key phrase of that movement was the slogan, "No means no." In other words, when a woman says no, a man is not to assume that she's secretly implying yes. Why? Well, because language is important and words have meanings. And they have to be respected and agreed upon for us to have a civil and lawful society. And that's where I want to start this lesson. Because one of the most alarming things was to see the Merriam-Webster dictionary choose the pronoun they as the word of the year for 2019, which is determined on the basis of frequencies of lookups and searches on their site. According to the dictionary, the pronoun they has seen an increase in lookups by 313% in 2019. I mean, even Merriam-Webster claims surprise that, quote, even a basic term, among the most common in the language, a personal pronoun, could rise to the top of their search data. The dictionary went on to explain that for over 600 years, the pronoun they has had a rather common meaning. As a gender-neutral, singular pronoun, it corresponds to the plural form of words like everyone and anyone. So we have sentences like, everyone likes pizza, don't they? Or anyone can come if they want to. But the lookups for the pronoun were not because people were writing college term papers and suddenly needing the standard definition. Instead, as Merriam-Webster describes, people who define their gender as non-binary, and we'll explain that in a bit, began using the pronoun to define themselves in a manner that allowed them to avoid gender descriptive terms like he or she. And this was all over the news. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal revealed in April that year during a House Judiciary Committee hearing on the Equality Act that her child was gender nonconforming and used the pronoun they. Singer Sam Smith announced also in 2019 that he would now use they and them as pronouns. Finally, the dictionary stated that it was increasingly common to see they and them as a person's pronouns in Twitter bios, email signatures, and conference name tags. For that reason, the dictionary, rather than providing an objective definition of the word, chose to alter the definition to be in alignment with the culture's usage. In a final statement on their website, Merriam-Webster stated that they do recognize that the, quote, non-binary they takes a plural verb despite referring to one person, end quote, and that it is understood that this can make the grammatically conservative uncomfortable. The grammatically conservative. Now, apparently, even language has to have political sides. But my point is this. The source of objective truth, the dictionary, made the decision to allow the word to have a subjective meaning. By their own admission, the word, which for over 600 years referenced a plurality of people, now could also mean a single individual if a person decided that was what they wanted in their Twitter bio. And just like that, left became right, and stop suddenly meant proceed. And a culture that wants you to understand that no means no also wants you to accept that they can also mean he or she whenever a person does not want to be labeled as he or she. But let me make something clear. The issue at hand is not a debate about grammar or definitions. We're just using this topic to point to a much larger reality. The root concern is over the issue of our culture's rapidly, and I mean rapidly, changing opinions on gender and biological sex. That dictionaries would alter their lexical meanings is just one example of the change. I want you to consider also the influence of social media. In 2014, the social media giant Facebook added 50 custom gender options to its profile editing capabilities. You heard that right. 50 options. This is why I said the changes were rapid. We did not morph from 2 genders to 3 or 4 options. We jumped to more than 50 overnight. And that should be seen as an indicator of where our culture is regarding personal and sexual identity. That we feel there can be over 50 different options beyond male and female. Traditional media also followed suit. In July of 2015, the award-winning socialite magazine Vanity Fair ran a cover story entitled "Call Me Caitlyn" to define the transition of former male Olympian Bruce Jenner into a woman. That same year, Glamour magazine awarded Jenner the Woman of the Year award, explaining that Jenner's transition was to be recognized so that, quote, in the future, kids won't have to wait until they are 65 years old to discover who they are, end quote. And just like that, we were introduced to a society where apparently male and female is no longer sufficient for young children. And that Glamour magazine would concern itself with children finding their identity is also a huge concern that we need to discuss later. Finally, the ramifications of these types of discussions made their way off the covers of magazines and the pages of dictionaries and into our everyday life. In 2016, North Carolina passed its House Bill 2, or HB 2 for short, which stated that access to bathrooms, locker rooms, and other sex-specific facilities in public schools was to be determined solely by biological sex as determined on a birth certificate. And the backlash was immense. The Department of Justice under the Obama administration used the full weight of the DOJ to sue the state for what they said was a violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Other states also weighed in. The governors of both San Francisco and New York banned publicly funded travel for government employees to North Carolina, which was blocking interstate cooperation. Big businesses jumped in as well. IBM, PayPal, Apple, and Facebook all took actions against the state. PayPal canceled plans for a $3.6 million expansion in the state, erasing the potential of 400 new jobs. And the NBA moved their 2017 All-Star game out of Charlotte in an ironic move given that the NBA and WNBA are defined based on biological differences. In other words, we woke up one day to find ourselves in a society that felt that a 16-year-old biological male who identified as she or they, or any other of 50 options, had a legal right per the federal government to walk into a girl's locker room in a public school. This was, in a sense, the tipping point for our culture. It wasn't simply that language was changing, but so were legal rights. And what was becoming clear was that the opening words of our own Declaration of Independence, that there are certain truths we hold to be self-evident, isn't exactly true. Not because there aren't such truths, but because the concept of self-evident when it comes to gender and biological sex has been lost. That's why we're holding this as our last session of True North. Our culture has made some astounding shifts in the last several years that Christians are trying to make sense of. I mean, how do we carry the gospel into a culture where language shifts? What should be the role of the church during these times? And how do we train up children in the way they should go when the very legal system we live under points them in opposing directions? Do the scriptures have anything to say here? I would say yes, that they are as faithful a guide and compass as always, and we want to look to them during this session. Now, this lesson is to be considered as the third part in a three-part teaching that surrounds the church's response to the topics of same-sex relationships and transgenderism. If you have not yet viewed the first two parts, let me strongly encourage you to do so before watching this segment. There are foundational points and conclusions made about how the scriptures address the importance of gender that we will refer to in this teaching, but not necessarily repeat in whole. You can find links to those teachings in the show notes below. Let's start right out of the gate and seeing how Scripture might give us a bearing or guidance through these types of circumstances. I want you to consider for a moment the Old Testament narrative regarding the reconstruction of Jerusalem under Nehemiah. According to the text, the difficulty would not be in finding skilled workers, but rather that they would have to build while actively dealing with opposition from outside forces. Nehemiah makes a strategic decision to survey the city and surrounding area before determining how he might begin. He talks about how he, for several days, opted to ride out at night and inspect the walls. He wanted to ensure he had a full understanding of what he was about to address. We get the sense that the Apostle Paul did the exact same thing while in Athens before trying to reason with the philosophers of the Areopagus. The text of the book of Acts tells us he had gone through the city observing and inspecting the various statues and shrines so that he could learn of all the gods they were worshiping before trying to debate and dialogue with them. In both instances, the men surveyed a landscape to educate themselves on what they were up against before trying to jump in with a solution. This is guidance for us. We should do the exact same thing and make sure we understand the full nature of the discussion around gender fluidity and examine exactly how we arrived at this point in our culture. Before jumping into biblical passages and theological considerations, we want to survey the gender fluid landscape and make sure we understand what we want to address. To begin with, there are actually two different discussions or issues at hand. First is the more traditional discussion surrounding transgenderism. I'm using the phrase traditional or classical transgenderism to define people who suffer from an internal struggle where they psychologically sense an alignment with the opposite gender from the biological sex assigned them at birth. Now, what is most notable about these individuals is that they do not debate the binary nature of sex as Christians understand it from the Scriptures. There is mutual agreement on the binary nature of sex and gender, that there's male and female, man, woman, he and she. There is agreement that biologically and scientifically speaking, A person is female if they are born with two X chromosomes, and a male if they're born with an X and a Y. Let me say this again. In issues of more traditional transgenderism, there is not an argument that the sexes defined in the scriptures are wrong or inaccurate. The issue for transgenders under this category is a personal and psychological wrestling regarding their alignment of the cultural sense of gender with their biological makeup. I say cultural sense because transgender individuals think of gender as a culturally defined issue. For example, we tend to match things like color to gender and suggest that blue means boy or pink means girl. We also associate things like dress and mannerisms to gender by saying that men wear suits and women wear dresses, and that men are strong and women are delicate. For classical transgenderism, the challenge is a psychological one of a person feeling that they more identify with the opposite gender, i.e. their cultural identity, from the biological sex they were assigned. Now, what results is often an initial attempt to modify their cultural appearance through both dress, hairstyles, and name changes. And then, if desired, they may actually opt to alter their actual physical bodies through surgery, or what is known as sex reassignment surgery. What is key is that people wrestling with this will most often try and bring their biology into alignment with their sense of cultural identity, as opposed to the reverse of that, adopting a cultural identity based upon their biology. And therein lies the tension. For the Christian, there should be a level of understanding here. Understanding, not necessarily acceptance. What I mean is this. Culturally, we understand what we would consider mild forms of this type of mental wrestling. I mean, a young girl growing up might prefer baseball, jeans, and a ball cap over dresses, dolls, or makeup. At an adolescent age, this person might simply be called a tomboy to suggest that she has masculine interests. Or conversely, a young boy might actually want to play with dolls, experiment with baking, and may have no obvious interest in sports. And we don't really react too much when we see it at early ages. We understand that identity is still forming. Transgenderism of the more historical type is where the person progresses into adulthood and begins to mentally believe they actually are intended to be the opposite gender, and that somehow there was a biological mishap with their physical bodies at birth. It's an internal wrestling that is very, very real for some people. Now, this does not mean that Christians embrace or accept the notion that a person can actually be the opposite gender simply by ignoring cultural norms and willing themselves to be something other than they were created. We're simply pointing out, in the case of classical transgenderism, a person who decides that they want to change is not trying to argue the duality of sex, but rather that they themselves simply do not feel aligned. This at least streamlines the discussion for the Christian. You're dealing with a person's internal psychological identity and not a broader debate about the genders that God created in Genesis, and that should help form our approach. Now, we also want to note that transgenderism is not remotely new to human history. What has been officially labeled as gender identity disorder can be traced significantly far back into human history. I mean, here in America, we actually find there were laws against cross-dressing as far back as the 1690s in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Initially, society began dealing with these types of issues through legislation by simply outlawing outward expressions of transgenderism. And as a result, people began seeking out medical or psychiatric help to try and find cures. My point in addressing all this is to highlight just how much of a struggle this is for some people. The fact that people wrestled with this during a time when the consequences could result in legal penalties is telling. I mean, to risk exposure when the consequence could be the inability to own land, buy a house, or even conduct business, tells us that the psychological distress was not simply manufactured, but was a very real struggle. This also helps us to grasp why suicide rates are abnormally high among the transgender community. That is still an undisputed reality today. Studies suggest that 20 to 40% of transgender adults admit to seriously contemplating suicide and having attempted it at least once. And the rationale is not too difficult to understand. To not sense a place of either biological or cultural acceptance means a complete absence of any sense of self or wholeness. Towards the end of this session, we're going to speak to the church's role in response for this. But for this first segment, let me simply say this. For some people, the issue of trying to reconcile an internal crisis of gender and sex is a legitimate nightmare. As Christians, we need to be very clear here. We do not embrace the world's response of normalizing the behavior. Nonetheless, we do have to make sure that we have compassion for those walking this path. We see the individual as someone who is experiencing the same results of a fallen creation that all of us do. And to that end, we point to a God who cares, a Savior who redeems, and a Spirit that empowers. More on this part towards the end of this lesson. The reason we have distinguished something called classical transgenderism is because today we're dealing with something else entirely. Gender dysphoria, the clinical label used by the medical community in the past, is no longer isolated to a simple misalignment of biological sex. Instead, there has been an evolution in this space where the number of genders and identities has grown exponentially, and the possible labels, it's become a confusing minefield of definitions. For example, a person who feels their cultural identity aligns to their biological sex would be labeled as cisgender, whereas a person who feels misaligned would be identified as transgender. Specifically, a trans woman is a biological female who identifies as a man, and a trans man is a biological male who identifies as a woman. But there's now what is known as gender creative, which is a person who refuses to believe there are only two genders and instead opts for any number of more recent gender identities. Specifically, they may label themselves as gender expansive. This suggests that they lie outside the binary male-female designations. They may opt for gender nonconforming, which means they do not want to be constrained to any cultural gender expression. There's also what's known as gender fluid, to indicate the desire to be allowed to actually shift or present different genders at different times, and gender queer, which is defined as a person sensing actually a combination of multiple genders. And this is only a few of the myriad number available today, which is where companies like Facebook suggest that they can define over 50 different options. Now, this is also where we run into the debate on pronouns, where people inside the gender creative, gender expansive, and gender queer categories have opted to avoid the traditional he or she. Instead, they've chosen to either redefine the meaning of existing plural pronouns, like we or they, to suggest a singular identity. Additionally, many have actually invented new words like Z or Zir, opting for the letter Z as what they feel is a more neutral expression. It is with this new and emerging form of transgenderism that I believe the church is facing a larger dilemma requiring, I'll say mandating, us to formulate a response. In the past, the church needed to simply exhibit compassion balanced with guidance and counseling. But we face something more daunting now that cannot be ignored. Let's turn our focus there. The biggest change surrounding transgenderism has been the way the field of psychiatric sciences has addressed the issue. As stated previously, there was a time where both the church and science were in agreement that people unable to identify with their biological gender were dealing with a mental disorder. And just to be clear, this phraseology is not meant to be derogatory. To label something a mental disorder is simply to acknowledge that there are issues or complications within the way a person's brain is processing thoughts and driving behaviors. Depression, bipolar, anxiety are all also classified as mental disorders of some form on the classification spectrum. To help catalog disorders and treatments, the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, began publishing what was known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM for short. In the DSM-3, published in 1980, transsexualism was identified as a disorder for adults, but it was labeled as gender identity disorder if it was seen in children. By 1994, in the DSM-4, this distinction was erased, and gender identity disorder became an umbrella term for all transgenderism. Then in 2013, a seismic shift happened with the release of the DSM-5. The official label was changed to gender dysphoria. But most notable about the diagnosis was that the APA stopped classifying the actual mental behavior as a disorder and instead began to suggest that only the emotional stress and anxiety that people felt were issues needing diagnosis. In other words, the APA began suggesting that the problem people were facing in this category was simply a series of emotional stresses and not an actual disorder of confused genders. This was a massive change, and in some respects could be viewed as the tipping point for how things have arrived at where we are today. In short, the medical and scientific community veered away from trying to treat the actual disorder and instead began suggesting that only the emotional distress itself should be treated. Now, why is this so important? Because it meant that the scientific community began to only seek the causes of related emotions and depressions and not the causes for the thoughts and patterns within the psyche itself. And what happened next was only a matter of time. It was soon decided that the reason members of this community felt distress wasn't because they were suffering from a disorder, but rather simply because they felt culturally ostracized. See the shift? Within the short span of a few years, the culture had deemed that the problem lay outside the transgender individual and not within them. If the distress they were feeling was caused by the stigma of unacceptance by a broader culture, well, then the course of treatment was to find ways to eliminate this, what was soon to be called oppression. And the oppression, or oppressor, was easily identified as the established norms and beliefs of a historically conservative society. And yes, Judeo-Christian biblical values and teachings were quickly pointed to as some of the foundations of the conservative mindsets we live with today that could be labeled as oppressors. The goal was to shift the stigma off the transgender individual and onto the person who would not culturally embrace them. And the result was immediate. The transgender community stopped seeing itself as a clinical community that was disordered. And instead, saw itself as a cultural community that was oppressed. Quickly, alliances with other communities emerged. The LGBT community adopted additional monikers to expand their collective into the LGBT and even LGBTQ. Phrases like transphobia emerged to harmonize with homophobia, to identify anyone who viewed transgenderism as anything other than normative. The growing mindset was that the conservative and traditional values of our society could be more easily fought through the collective sense of oppression than as individualized efforts. The transgender community began to establish itself as a normative segment of society, even developing flags of their own to mark an official identity. And it began to receive the backing of the political and business sphere as support. Now, this change in approach by the medical community and society at large, this cannot be overstated. To pivot from treating the individual to blaming their environment was a complete abandonment of moral reasoning and rational care. Think of it this way. When a terminally ill patient reaches a stage where modern medicine has no hope for a cure, it opts to only seek to make the patient comfortable. Hospice is called, and friends and family will gather around the individual to simply try and comfort them, even telling them that everything's going to be all right. This is kind of where we are now. Society, science included, has decided to seek the comfort of those who are dealing with gender dysphoria. The treatment prescribed requires simply that the surrounding society adopt the charade that everything's fine. But of course it's not fine. To go this route, from the church's perspective, is to see the culture acting as a form of hospice to the transgender community. We simply want them comfortable, not whole. And so the church is presented with a huge theological task. For starters, we aren't to be surprised by what is taking place around us. The scriptures speak clearly to what times will be like as the days grow shorter. In his letter to the church in Rome, Paul mentions the very concept that sin evolves from people personally violating God's blueprint for humanity into a form of cultural acceptance, even approval. This is exactly what we're seeing today. The church has to realize that it has a twofold calling in this environment. First, we remain a spiritual hospital for those who would try and find healing. We need to recall the words of our Lord and Savior. When asked by the religious experts why he spent time with the pagans, he replied, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. And I've not come to call the righteous, but the sinners." The church always starts with compassion, not judgment. We should, better than anyone, understand the effects of the fall and how sin has so disastrously impacted our creation. People, not just transgender people, are people who are hurting and broken. In an op-ed in the New York Times in 2018, Andrea Long Chu, an American writer who has undergone gender transition surgery, published a piece exposing the painful reality of what it's like to live with gender dysphoria. Although opting for sex reassignment surgery, Chu wrote about accepting the fact that it was not going to bring comfort. Chu wrote, "Dysphoria feels like being unable to get warm, no matter how many layers you put on. It feels like hunger without appetite. It feels like getting on an airplane to fly home only to realize mid-flight that this is it. You're going to spend the rest of your life on an airplane. It feels like grieving. It feels like having nothing to grieve." Finally, Chu noted, quote, "There are no good outcomes in transition. There are only people begging to be taken seriously. Similar to what we said in our session on same-sex relationships, there is a portion of the transgender community that still wrestles with a sense of being lost despite the culture trying to patronize them with acceptance. They are deeply wrestling. And to borrow Chu's words, they are begging to be taken seriously. And for this portion of our culture today, the church needs to be there with open arms to point to the one who designed them in the first place. Also, in similar fashion to our teachings in part 1 and 2 on same-sex issues, healing does not necessarily mean that the transgender embraces their biological gender. Healing means they embrace Christ as their Savior. The goal should be for them to begin to wrestle with Him on a path towards sanctification rather than trying to wrestle with themselves. Now, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. And again, it's imperative that you watch parts 1 and 2 as foundation for this. I am not suggesting acceptance of transgender behavior or normalizing it. I'm not condoning that we begin honoring alternate pronouns. What I am suggesting is that we would deal with people honestly struggling the same way we would deal with a person burdened with depression. We would point them to the same path of sanctification all of us have to walk on. The transgender person might suggest that we don't know their pain or the suffering they would have to endure to disown their internal sense of self. That's fine. But sanctification openly suggests there will be suffering and a carrying of a cross where sins and desires are to be crucified daily. This isn't a special pathway that we're prescribing for transgender people. It is the pathway for every Christian who would want to know Christ. It's the requirement for every believer that our identity be surrendered in exchange for Christ, and our present reality would be sacrificed in earnest expectation of our heavenly and eternal reward. For the church, we simply need to be strong enough and bold enough to invite the transgender who is honestly seeking God to walk the pathway with us and not feel somehow isolated because of their condition. Jesus is the answer for you and is also the answer for them. The church, however, needs to take on its second scripturally defined role as well. And in my opinion, this is the more difficult one. In addition to being a hospital for the lost, Jesus also appointed the church to be a city on a hill. The concept was that by way of its elevation, the visibility of its light would be easily seen by those in the dark. Jesus actually taught this in combination with the instruction that we are also to be the salt of the earth. The simple meaning is that the presence of the church in the world is a preservative against what would otherwise be a rapid decay of morality. Taken together, the interpretation is that the church's role within the culture around it is to be a light that continuously points to Christ, while also acting as a dwelling for God's Spirit among the culture so that the truth of God's blueprint for humanity can be proclaimed. This role was never more necessary than it is now because of where the conversation and momentum around transgenderism has migrated. Because the culture and the scientific community with it have adopted a stance that transgenderism is now normative and that this community is to be seen as a healthy segment of society, it has also become something now that industry targets and markets to, and this includes children. Remember earlier when I said that Glamour magazine showcased Caitlyn Jenner under the rubric that it would, in their words, help children find their identity early on? This focus on the youth of our culture has become alarming, and this is something we need to focus on in this lesson. In 2015, Michelle T., an author and activist in San Francisco, began what was called the Drag Queen Story Hour, where public libraries would sponsor space for transgender and transsexual individuals to read books that support the LGBTQ ideology to children within the age ranges of 3 to 11. The goal, stated clearly and plainly from their own website, is to, quote, instill the imagination and play of gender fluidity of childhood and give kids glamorous, positive, and unabashedly queer role models, end quote. Now, this program has been adopted by libraries all across the United States and has received sponsorship from businesses within those communities. Recently, this type of targeting of children has also moved into media and programming. Just this month, which has been officially recognized as Pride Month to celebrate the normative approach to the LGBTQ culture, the popular children's program Blue's Clues posted a video on its YouTube channel called the Blue's Clues Pride Parade Sing-Along. In the video, an animated Nina West, a popular drag queen, sings about the normative nature of families with 2 dads, 2 moms, and non-binary children. Take a look.
Hey, Blue, look at all these families! Hi, families! It's time for a pride parade. Families marching 6 by 6, hurrah! Hurrah! Families marching 6 by 6, hurrah! Hurrah! Ace, Bi, and Pan grown-ups, you see, can love each other so proudly! And they all go marching in the big parade. Oh, yeah!
Additionally, the popular children's programming network Nickelodeon released a video with the same Nina West singing about the meaning of the pride flag and the celebration that surround alternative genders and lifestyles. And the list goes on. Is there a problem here? Well, there is. As sociologists and psychiatrists have studied the transgender movement, there has been one undeniable trend. The rates of people identifying as one of the emerging gender identities has rapidly exploded. 5 years ago, it was estimated that 1 in 300 adults would admit to some form of gender dysphoria. Today, that number stands at 1 in 166, 1 in 166, or roughly 0.6% of our adult society. Among youth, however, the rates are far surpassing that. Within the teenage range up through the early 30s, the rate stands at 12% and continues to climb. Now, when asked to account for the increase, psychologists and sociologists agree that essentially 2 factors are likely at play. Now, on the one hand, the larger exposure to these issues and the lessening of the stigma surrounding them has allowed people wrestling with gender dysphoria to come forward more easily. And that is certainly possible, but highly unlikely if you're going to think it accounts for the exponential rates in young people. For this, an additional factor called social contagion is also likely at play. This is defined as an adoption of behaviors, attitudes, and mindsets by people as a result of media and cultural messaging that spreads through a population essentially as an infection. Now, this isn't a term isolated to issues of transgenderism. Instead, it's just a cultural dynamic that explains how cultures adopt behaviors. It affects attitudes and adoption for things like smoking, vaping, even whether or not the culture will adopt recycling. The point is that among youth, where susceptibility and a desire for acceptance abounds, it's less likely that transgenderism is occurring naturally as much as it is being adopted and explored. In other words, it's indoctrination. Remember what we said earlier. The transition of the American Psychiatric Association away from treating gender dysphoria to suggesting it only wanted to treat the emotional distress, that led to an approach that identified treatment as simply the erasing of oppressive forces within the culture. The result was that the transgender community ceased to be identified as a grouping under a medical condition and instead adopted a cultural and political identity who openly boast of an agenda to teach gender fluidity and genderqueer values. And the strategy is plain. Rather than wasting time trying to change the mindsets of older adults who are not going to be easily persuaded, the tactic has turned to indoctrinating future generations. And this is where the church needs to understand its role. It's one thing for us to act in compassion towards those honestly wrestling with a cultural versus a biological identity. But it's entirely another when we perceive what is clearly a spiritual battle for the hearts and minds of our youth. The current debate and the new gender identities is not something the church can embrace. Why? Because it directly contradicts the scriptures and suggests that the values and truths that God has given to humanity are somehow oppressive, and that is evil. This is where our true north teaching has to kick in. We are not at liberty to define our own truth or evaluate whether the culture's truths sound good or reasonable, as Paul said in Colossians. Again, please watch parts 1 and 2 of this segment surrounding same-sex relationships, because in those lessons we point to the reasoning for God adopting 2 genders as the blueprint for His creation. There was an intentional illustration on His end woven into the tapestry of our physical existence that was intended to point to the spiritual reality of His relationship to us. To suddenly suggest that a person can express both genders, or can express alternate genders, or even express an absence of gender, that is to completely erase God's illustration of Himself that He wrote into His own creation. And this, for the church, has to be viewed with a spiritual lens and not a social justice one. We've largely stated this already, but I wanted to summarize it here at the end should you ever want to reference these teachings again in the future and just could quickly move to the end of the lesson for these summarizations. The issue of transgenderism in our culture can essentially be broken into 2 large categories. Classical transgenderism, which does not deny the binary nature of gender as male or female. It is simply the psychological wrestling of a person who doesn't feel their cultural identity or sense of self matches their biological sex. But we also now are dealing with the emergence of additional gender identities, which suggests that a person can actually experience multiple additional or even an absence of gender altogether. For the church, our response can also be broken into 2 main areas. First and foremost, we are a place of compassion that understands we live in a fallen world. Sin is not a catalog of offenses and behaviors that elicit God's anger. Sin is the condition of our creation, having separated from God at the onset. As a result, the entirety of creation is in decay. The adversary is in a position of powerful manipulation, and our physical self has the capacity to override and control the spiritual self. For those willing, God extends the offering of the atonement of Christ, the pathway of sanctification, and the empowerment of His Spirit as a means of reconciliation to Him and to hope for eternity. The church is the community of those who have collectively decided to pursue God in this venture. Homosexuals, heterosexuals, transgenders, cisgenders, all alike are welcome to pursue God provided there's an agreement that surrender to Christ is necessary and obedience to His word provides the guidepost. When Jesus declared that prostitutes and tax collectors would enter heaven ahead of the righteous, this is what He was referring to. Not a blind acceptance of sinful lifestyles, but an openness that is available to anyone willing to surrender their life, forgo their own cultural identity in exchange for a passionate pursuit of holiness and grace. For the person experiencing the pain and confusion of transgenderism, who desperately wants to know the identity that God would give them, the church is to be a place where they find warmth, grace, and guidance. The second response of the church understands that our society has ceased to try and treat gender dysphoria and is instead now on a path to normalize the LGBTQ community, which includes strategic pathways of labeling those who disagree as oppressors and seeking legal penalties and even attempting to indoctrinate youth with a pro-LGBTQ ideology. For this, the church needs to act as a lighthouse, unmoved by the cultural sea swirling around it while emitting the light of God's truth to His creation. We cannot go contrary to Scripture, not because we're afraid of change or because we hold to archaic beliefs, but rather because we hold that God's truths are the only blueprint of hope for a world that has limited time prior to God's decision to conclude everything. We cannot grant that there are multiple genders because this erases God's image from our world. We do not support that there should be pride around an LGBTQ lifestyle, not because we see it as uniquely perverse, but rather because we see it as simply another facet of the fallen world around us. And we passionately stand against the attempts to indoctrinate youth with ideologies because we recognize the reality of spiritual warfare inherent in that tactic, which directly seeks to invert God's order. Only when the church understands the dual roles it needs to occupy in this cultural space can we hope to effectively see God's kingdom represented adequately.